Hi there. Today I'll be doing an analysis of William Blake's illustrations for Paradise Lost. In case you don't know, I don't believe there have been any bigger fans of John Milton than William Blake. William Blake even went so far as to create an epic poem of a meeting and revive John Milton. It noted that Milton loved me in childhood and showed me his face. In this project, I'll be showing you these illustrations and providing analysis from both Paradise Lost and Blake's own songs of innocence and experience. So let's look at this first image. This image depicts Satan rousing the fallen angels, a scene from the beginning of the book after they had been cast by hell. It's interesting to note how William Blake was one of many poets who considered Satan to be the hero in Paradise Lost. We can see this in the pose which Satan has triumphantly. He stands almost defiant, and all the other rebel angels are despairing, as you can see from the bottom right here. As they wallow in the fires of hell, he stands above them, as if to show that he's somehow different and at the same time also better. So the quote that this brings in mind comes from the beginning of the book as well, when he says, "All is not lost, the unconquerable will, and study of revenge, immortal hate, and courage never to submit or yield, and what is else not to be overcome." A quote which he uses to rally the angels to continue to fight God. I think Blake uses a great way to illustrate this. And, this kind of reminds me of William Blake's other work, which is entitled The Shepherd. If you look at The Shepherd, it feels kind of similar, because as the shepherd acts as a protector of the lamb, Satan, at the same time, acts as a protector for the rebel angels. He's like the guide. He's the one who will steer these angels towards their ultimate goal, which is obviously towards the destruction of God. I feel like when he says, "For he hears the lamb's innocent call," Satan hears the call of the rebel angels and responds in turn. Now we're going to be looking at the second image, which is Satan, Sin, and Death. In this image, we can see the battle between Satan right here, we can see Death right here, and in the middle, this is Sin. So once again, I like the way that both Satan and Death are juxtaposed when they're both holding the spear. It's like a juxtaposition of the left and the right, with Sin being in the middle. So once again, I can see Satan being depicted as a very heroic figure, because the way he's posed brings in mind images of heroes like Achilles or Troy, for instance. He's clearly shown as the more heroic figure here, as compared to Death, who is, by the expression on his face and by the way that his body is composed, is not intended to be the protagonist in this scene. And additionally, I thought it was interesting, if you look at the body of Death, how accurate Blake kept the depiction of Milton's work, because in many instances, Death is depicted as a skeleton-like figure. However, Milton's Paradise Lost shows Death as sort of this translucent, see-through figure, which is exactly what Blake shows in here. So, I think this is an allegory, right? Because, obviously, Satan's daughter is Sin, and Satan had an incestuous relationship with Sin, which gave birth to Death. So, that's sort of that, poetic allegory, as in disobedience of the Satan leads to sin, and all that sin can lead to is death. And we can also see the way that Sin is trying to reach up to touch both Death and Satan, as if sin is this interlocking in-between disobedience and death. That's what you get. But when I see this image, I quickly think about this quote from Milton that says, "O Father, what intends thy hand against thy only son? What fury, O Son, possesses thee to bend that mortal dart against my father's head?" I thought that kind of language also shows this maternal image with Blake uses in a lot of his images. So we can see obviously the maternal image of Sin trying to mediate between the two clashing parts of masculinity right here. And for example, in works like On Another Sorrow, which you can see right here, we can also see the way that the woman raises up another person, right? I think this is another example of Blake's idea of this feminine kind of piece, because again, Sin is the one trying to mediate the conflict here, while both are fighting. Alright, so now we'll be looking at the third illustration, which is called Christ Decides to Redeem Man. So, as you can see, this illustration brings into mind the quote from Book 3, which states, "Account me, man, I, for his sake, will leave thy bosom and its glory next to thee," which Milton expresses this unselfishness of the Son, be willing to sacrifice himself for the salvation of mankind. I think something interesting here is the way that Blake hides the true face of both God and the Son here. So it definitely calls into mind some quotes from Milton, because, example, there's a passage that states, "He though whom no almighty Father shines, whom else no creature can behold," which calls into mind that idea that God is unseeable because of his sheer beauty. No mortal can comprehend it. So at the bottom, we can see Satan, and you see Satan. This is the point where Satan has been expelled from heaven, but he's also coasting from the wall of heaven on this side of night. So he's on like the edge of heaven, but he obviously can't go back into it. And the way that Satan lies in this picture really just exemplifies the sort of confidence and self-assurance which Satan is trying to gain. His determination to follow through his plans, even though right above, they're plotting on how to redeem mankind after Satan inevitably wins by corrupting Adam and Eve. So I saw a similar pose in Songs of Experience, which is very interesting considering the contents of Songs of Experience. This poem right here, we can obviously see very similar pose between both Satan and this here, which is interesting considering the contents of the poem. So if you look right here, O earth, return, arise from out the dewy grails, turn away no more." So this is a muse, like, trying to call out to the fallen man to return back to the innocence and that primordial bliss of that Eden, in that sense. So, you know, obviously this poem takes place after the fall. However, the interesting thing is right here, this is God seeing that mankind will fall and Jesus deciding to redeem humanity. So that sort of parallel and contrast there is very interesting. "Calling the lapsed soul and weeping in the evening dew that might control the starry pole and fallen light renew." So now we're going to be looking at the fourth illustration, which is called Satan Spying on Adam and Eve's Descent into Paradise. So let's look at this. So this picture is evidently divided into three parts, as you can see here. So the first part is we can see the envious Satan watching Adam and Eve. The second part is we can see Raphael receiving instructions from God. And the third part is Adam and Eve walking together in the garden. So the first thing I want to know is that look at the uncertainty which Satan shows on his face. You know, it's clear there's a difference from the last illustration. So he's undergoing much more uncertainty about the validity and the possibility of his quest. It's similar to the quote from Paradise Lost that states, "That bring to my remembrance from what state I fell, how glorious, once above thy sphere, till pride and worse ambition threw me down, warring in heaven against heaven's matchless king." You know, he remembers the peerless grace that he originally had, and he knows that perhaps he'll never win the war against God. It's also really notable to see how Satan and the serpent are contrasted with Adam and Eve. So Satan is twisted with the serpent, even as he has his angel wings on, as kind of this perverse, twisted connection, which symbolizes his status as this fallen angel. Meanwhile, Adam and Eve are delicate. They're loving, displaying that innocence that humanity had before the fall. And Raphael, he's the only thing which stands in between the hell of Satan and the heaven of Adam and Eve. Remember, Milton said that when Satan walks, for within him hell he brings and around about him, because Satan is the embodiment of hell. Meanwhile, somebody like Eve is discussed in having perfect beauty adorned, in being an apparent queen, unveiled her pierceless light. When I see this, I think about the poem "The Little Boy Found," which is in the Songs of Innocence. It's interesting because it says, "The little boy lost in a lonely fen, led by the wandered light, began to cry, but God ever nigh, appeared like his father in white." And in that sense, you know, just how God protects the little boy, God, through Raphael, is protecting Adam and Eve. God is their protector, and as long as he stands there will be no harm done to them by any person. Now we're going to be looking at illustration 5 of Paradise Lost. So, illustration 5 is one of contrast, almost stark contrast between Satan and Adam and Eve. So what I mean by that is, look at the way that Adam and Eve's relationship, this kiss right here, is contrasted with Satan and his serpent up here. Adam and Eve are obviously in an idyllic, beautiful place with flowers and lilies all around, embracing each other with this true, innocent love, which Blake obviously really likes. Meanwhile, Satan above, he stares in that envy and jealousy. It's reminiscent of a quote in Book 4, when Satan looks and he notes, "With kisses pure, aside the devil turn, for envy, yet with jealous leer maligned." Satan wants that pure, innocent love, which Adam and Eve have, but he can't get it. Instead, he turns towards his serpent in a mockery of Adam and Eve. Look at that. And it is as if he is going to kiss the serpent, which is that sheer, degeneracy which Satan has fallen into. And this in turn shows this agony which Satan always experiences throughout this Paradise Lost, this agony of losing his heavenly self in his angelic form. Interestingly, also note how Eve looks at Adam, but she also looks at Satan. And I feel like this is foreshadowing. This is that foreshadowing to that idea that Eve is constantly being tempted by Satan, and that she's the first one to fall by eating the apple. And even in her bliss, she notices and is sort of tempted by Satan at that time. And it's interesting to know how Satan has taken elements from both sin and death. You can see that the stars on Satan's wings have become a little bit transparent. And he has the snake of sin. So it's the transparency of death and the snake of sin. Thus, this implies how death and sin are now part of Satan instead of being separate entities. Before, there was Satan, there was sin, and there was death. Now, Satan is all of those at once. This is what he has become. One more interesting detail is, look at right here of Adam. Look at this crown of thorns. This instantly calls to mind ideas of Christ in crown of thorns. But Adam's a crown of flowers. And the contrast here is interesting because, Christ's crown of thorns was created during his greatest pain, while Adam's is created during the greatest joy. So for this poem, I think this reminds me quite a bit of, one moment please. So anyway, this reminds me, this poem right here, Infant Joy. Because Adam and Eve at this point aren't infants. And remember, keep in mind that Blake doesn't think that sexuality is wrong. He thinks it's a good thing, actually. This sort of innocent love, like I said. And it's similar in this infant joy, right? There's kind of that flower blooming. There's kind of that, blooming of sexuality, which Blake feels strongly about. And it's kind of similar, because it's I have no name. I am but 2 days old. Just like how Adam and Eve are only a couple days old. And they feel this joy from sexuality. Now we're going to be looking at illustration 6, where Raphael starts to talk to Adam about sin and about Satan. First of all, there's a lot of warning signs in this work about the future of Adam and Eve. First of all, let's look at the contrast between Adam and Eve at this scene. Adam, as you can see, he's paying full attention to Raphael, and his arms are moving as if to indicate that he is in fact listening to what Raphael has to say. In other versions of this illustration, Adam even has his head raised up high, as if to look towards the transcendental message instead of the physical one. But in that vein, look at the way that Raphael's arms are positioned. He's sending a message from God himself, because God doesn't want Adam and Eve to make excuses when they inevitably do fall from the Garden of Eden. He wants them to know that they have the free will to choose to sin or not. However, let's take a look at Eve real quick. Look at where she's looking. You can see that clearly all her eyes are on Adam here. A banquet of grapes in her hand as she stares deep into Adam's eyes. Grapes have been considered a sign of vanity, and perhaps they're used as a vain image for a character who could be sometimes considered as vain, such as looking at herself in the pond which is allusion to Narcissus of Greek mythology, of course. Now let's look back at this tree real quick. So this tree, first of all, clearly this is symbolic of the dangers of the tree. There's an ever-present danger of this sacred tree of wisdom. But you can also see quite a few animals in the background as well. I think I see a horse, and horses in medieval times were traditionally considered to be a Renaissance symbol of lust. And it's that lust for knowledge, for wisdom, that ultimately corrupts Eve and corrupts all of mankind. And one of the most important things is look at the way that Eve stands in between Raphael and Adam. She is separating them because Raphael is essentially representing God, the heavenly part, and Adam is humans. So Eve is the person who is dividing between Adam and Raphael, which is symbolic of the fact that she ultimately is the one who eats the fruit and causes that separation between God and humankind. So it reminds me of the quote which Raphael says, "Because we freely love, as in our will, to love or not, in this we stand or fall, and some are fallen to disobedience fallen." Both Adam and Eve do not have any excuse for if they sin, because they already have been told the consequences and the free will to choose to do it or not do it. So when I see this image of Adam and Eve, I think about the poem The Human Abstract. Because look at the Human Abstract. It says, "Pity would be no more if we did not make somebody poor. And mercy no more could be if all were happy as we." So Blake is trying to say here, just like how free will dooms humanity, these traits, mercy and pity, while they seem good, in reality, it's sort of a self-fulfilling cycle, because there would be no need for like pity or mercy if there's nobody who was required it. So in that same sense, these basic human characteristics are what ultimately brings us down in an odd metaphysical sense. So on to number 7. This illustration shows you the final outcast of Satan into hell by Christ and his loyal angels. I wouldn't say there's a whole lot to discuss in this illustration behind what's obvious. Take a look. We see this beautiful Christ figure, obviously, extending his arm and his bow up high. He reaches down towards the rebel angels, who seem to tremble in fear and suffering as he aims his arrows at them. This is very accurate to the book because it also notes how Milton declared, "Bring forth all my war, my bow and thunder, my almighty arms gird on, and sword upon thy puissant thigh." Christ is not seen as like a savior here. He's seen as a more of a force, more of an entity in that sense, because the way he showed is almost in a warlike sense. He's quite scary. It's like the Christ that will appear at the Last Judgment instead of the Christ who wanders across the land teaching people and giving miracles. So this is a very interesting depiction of Christ, I would have to say. And passages like of his fierce chariot rolled as with the sound of torrent floods, again, gives this image of Christ as the Son of God, instead of Christ, the Redeemer of mankind. Anyway, it's hard to describe any specific poem within Songs of Innocence and Experience that this goes with. I don't feel like there's a lot of poems from that collection which fits that. However, I do have to bring in mind this work. This is William Blake's The Ancient of Days, and it's once again a biblical design. So yeah, it shows God outstretching a compass over the world. So I think this is a really interesting contrast to this, because just this singular figure extending all their power from the sky towards down below. So now on to number 8. This depicts Eve being created by Jesus, which is somewhat of an interesting interpretation that one doesn't see very much. So obviously you can see here, Jesus is essentially like raising Eve out of nothing, just like how God created Adam out of nothing. So most of the retellings of the story obviously show Eve being created by God the Father.
I think that Blake uses Christ here because he believes in the importance and prominence of Christ as a creation figure. He appears a lot in Blake's previous interpretations of Paradise Lost, such as the Christ begging his father to redeem mankind, or Christ fighting the rebel angels. So notice how Eve isn't even made of clay or taken from the flesh of Adam. It seems obvious to me that Blake's Eve is one that's created spiritually, not of the earth or of the man. So Eve is an independent being. This may seem weird, but this actually does have some precedent within Milton, when God refers to Jesus as my word, my wisdom, and my effectual might, which is in Book 3, line 170. The portrayal of Jesus in this fashion, thus, does have some basis within the text. Also, look at the fact that Eve is turned upwards, as if she is looking towards the heavens, reverently. This is another sign of Eve being a spiritual being, not simply a blank shell. The poem that comes to mind is obviously The Lamb by William Blake in Songs of Innocence. Not only, obviously, is Jesus called the Lamb of God, but I would say in this case, Eve is the Lamb of Jesus, right? Look at the lines. Little lamb who made thee, dost thou know who made thee, gave thee life and bid thee feed. Eve is trying to figure out who created her. She is the lamb trying to discover who she is and where she came from. Jesus is also the lamb, so I think that's sort of an interesting parallel here. We are called by his name, little lamb God calls thee. So I do think that this poem really fits with this idea of creation and spirituality of your creator. So for obvious reasons, this is one of the most important illustrations within the entire book. This is the temptation and fall of Eve. So obviously this depicts Eve eating the fruit from the tree of good and evil, and subsequently the fall of mankind. But there's more to this than you might think. So look at the kiss which Eve gives the serpent. It brings into mind the illusion from a previous illustration that we saw of Adam kissing Eve. This accursed union between human and snake is a depiction of like the degeneracy in the fall of man from the pure love which was experienced in the previous illustration. Blake provides a highly accurate version of this scene, as Satan talks about, on the fruit she gazed, which to behold might tempt alone, and in her ears the sound yet rung of his persuasive words. It's clear that both Milton and Blake think of Eve as this foolish character who easily slips into the depths of hell with a few words and a thought of beauty. In fact, Milton even says, into her heart too easy entrance won. From the way that the serpent is wrapped around Eve, take a look. It's kind of a mental grip which Satan has created. She's wrapped around Eve. Satan also makes Eve swallow his words, swallow his unholy words with the apple. As you can see from the expression on Eve's face, clearly she's realized through the first bite the mistake she has made. To quote Milton once again, sky lord and muttering thunder, some sad drops wet, which is quite obvious based on the background of this word. Look at the storm clouds and the thunder and the lightning. Even the earth itself has wept, for original sin has been completed, and the earth itself must now be the enemy of Adam and Eve. There's no more idyllic paradise for them. Now there's going to be snow and hail and rain and all these terrible things which will hurt them. So look at Adam. He stands blissfully aware. He's still in paradise. He still has this paradise of innocence. Soon though, Eve will give him the experience as well, and Adam will accept the apple because of his pure love for Eve. And the fate of both will be the fate of mankind, to be expelled from paradise, distanced from God, and to finally know evil. So when I'm asked what poem is the best parallel for this, I look at the poison tree actually. So for obvious reasons, yes, obviously there's a poison tree, those are the parallels, but it's more than that. This poem is about a person who bottles up his emotions. I was angry with my friend, I told my wrath did not end. I was angry with my foe, I told it not, my wrath did grow. And I think it's the same thing with Eve. Eve let these feelings of self-beauty and narcissism and egotism build up until eventually it destroyed her. You know, it caused a calamity. Just how, like, in the poison tree there's a calamity created by the wrath, Eve creates a calamity with her narcissism and feelings of beauty and want. parallels and the contrasts here are pretty interesting, especially considered the poison tree. And I do think that this is a deliberate thing by Blake to create this image. I'm going to be looking at the next one, which is the judgment of Adam and Eve. So once again, we see Christ in a very prominent role. You can see that he's depicted as a holy figure and as a prominent role in creation, and he is the bringer of judgment towards Adam and Eve, delivering them the punishment. He is, according to Milton, the mild judge and intercessor of both descendants of man. Yet the dramatic irony here is that ultimately he ends up saving them. You know, we can see the drastic changes which Adam and Eve have undergone already. So notice the loincloths, which is symbolic of the loss of innocence and gaining of the experience from the fruit. Adam, I notice, is more unhappy than upset, as he noted that when he ate from Eve's hand, he thought, from her hand I could suspect no ill, and what she did, whatever in itself her doing, seemed to justify the deed. So Adam doesn't really think it's his fault. I mean, he thinks that Eve manipulated him into eating the fruit. On the other hand, Eve buries her head in her hands, knowing she will be the one deemed responsible, with shame night overwhelmed, as Milton said. Also, look at the top, the way sin and death. So obviously you can see death right here, and you can see sin right here. So this calls back to the second illustration, because now sin and death can enter in the world from hell. And we can see death. He's raining down darts, symbolic of the fact that humanity can die now, people can die now. And we can see this raining down of a vial of liquid, which is symbolic of the sickness which humanity will have to deal with, the diseases and the plagues and such. And also notice how sin and death are wrapped together. You can't have sin without death, and vice versa. The serpent at the bottom moves below Adam's heel as punishment, which is a symbol of the serpent's cursed existence and position for eternity for what it caused. I think that there's a very interesting parallel here between this illustration and The Sick Rose by John Milton. So, look at this one. O rose, thou art sick, the invisible worm that flies in the night in the howling storm. So, I think that the worm is kind of like Satan in this case, and humanity, and Adam and Eve are kind of the rose, and the serpent, Satan, poisoned them. So now all of humanity is poisoned and sick, just like the roses. So I think those are two really interesting parallels about how this experience, you know, from the worm and from the apple of Eden, caused blemishes to this beautiful innocence, which Blake likes so much. So now we're going to be looking at illustration 11, which is an interesting one. It's Michael showing Adam a vision of the future of Jesus' crucifixion. It's a depiction, obviously, of the crucifixion of Christ, an event which will redeem humanity and wash away the original sin of Adam and Eve. In this, we can also see the defeat of sin and death. So, see, look here. You can see how the nail which pierces Christ's feet also pierces the serpent. It relates to the quote in Paradise Lost in Book 12, where Michael says that the crucifixion of Christ will bruise the head of Satan, crush his strength, defeating sin and death, his two main arms. And obviously you can see here, look, there's death. Right here, there's sin. So, I also notice, look at Adam. The way he's looking up, he also does not have his loincloth, which I believe is symbolic of the return of innocence which Christ will give. So this vision itself has at least temporarily restored it for Adam. He also finds some sort of inner peace, as you can see by his face here. It's reflected by a quote after Michael's story where he says, "Greatly instructed I shall hence depart, greatly in peace of thought and have my fill." So essentially Adam, after seeing this, he's reassured because he knows that eventually humanity will be restored and redeemed because of the selflessness of Christ. And I think the poem that expresses this really well is A Dream, which is also by Blake. In this poem, an unknown speaker has a dream of a spiritually lost ant, that an emmet lost his way, where on grails methought I lay, trouble wildered and forlorn, dark benighted, travel worn. However, they managed to find their way back to innocence. Follow now the Beatles' hum, little wanderer hide thee home, because of the Beatles' intervention. The fact is, though, this is just a dream, just as how Adam's return to innocence is also a dream. However, it still brings both of them comfort to know that it is still possible to go back to this previous state with the help from others, namely the beetle and Christ. And it's this ability to return to innocence from experience which appears in a lot of Blake's poems, and it seems in Milton's Paradise Lost as well. Something interesting I didn't mention is Eve, actually. Take a look. Eve is put to sleep in much the same way which Adam was put to sleep when Eve was created by Christ. So I think that what Milton is trying to say is perhaps Eve isn't worthy of being seen, or perhaps she doesn't have the capacity to witness such a great event in the future, because Adam obviously gets to look upon the future redemption of mankind, but Eve for some reason doesn't. So I think that Milton perhaps is trying to use this motif to suggest ideas of the female will needs to be destroyed in order for spiritual renewal. In order for this to happen, Eve has to not do anything. Essentially, I do think that Milton is having an anti-Eve message here, trying to tell us that, Eve does not take any part in this. So last, we reach the final illustration, which shows Adam and Eve being expelled from the Garden of Eden. So when I see this, notice how Michael holds the hands of both Adam and Eve, as if to comfort them. This is a militant angel, one who in the last illustration had a spear, yet he's also compassionate here. Also, I noticed, look at this, there are thorns beneath the feet of Adam. So this obviously brings into mind this idea that not only will they experience death and disease, they will also experience nature itself going against them. However, in that, I think that these thorns also offer hope, because they bring into mind the image of Jesus' crown of thrones, which will redeem humanity. And it's also interesting to notice how both Adam and Eve are looking directly down at the serpent right here, cautious of the danger of Satan, as he will always be lurking amongst them. As Milton said, the brandished sword of God before them blazed fierce as a comet. And this is fairly evident. There's a blazing sword appearing here. And the guardians with dreadful faces thronged and fiery arms. And the guardians are here. And I also noticed there are 4 mounts. And these 4 mounts, I think, are supposed to be reminiscent of the 4 horses of the apocalypse. Additionally, something notable to look at this work is the fairly calm expressions of Adam and Eve throughout. They have their loincloths on again, and they look quite serious. Not exactly upset, maybe a little bit, but not really crying or anything. I think this ties in heavily with the ending of Paradise Lost. It talks about how they dropped some tears, but they quickly went away as they realized all the possibilities which their life now has. It's a new world, and despite the dangers of Satan, of sin, and of death, they are ready to take it on. The most obvious comparison to this has to be with the cover of the Songs of Innocence and Spirits. So let's take a look at this. So as you can see here, this is also another depiction of these cover of the fall of the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. As you can see here, you see Adam and Eve falling down, literally, from heaven, from paradise. But something interesting to see here is that there's a bird. Look at this bird right here, flying overhead. I think this is symbolic, that Blake put this as a hint to say that innocence can perhaps still be achieved in time. I think that the dramatic yet hopeful nature of both of these emphasizes Blake's belief that innocence can be returned and redemption can be sought no matter what the sin is. And another poem which I thought was fairly comparable was The Garden of Love, also by Blake from the Songs of Experience. I went to the Garden of Love and saw what I had never seen. A chapel was built in the mist where I used to play on the green. And the gates of the chapel were shut, and thou shalt not write over the door. So I turned to the Garden of Love that so many flowers bore, and I saw it was filled with graves, and tombstones where flowers should be, and priests in black gowns were making their rounds, and binding with briars my joys and desires. So I think that this poem is very similar because it depicts a garden which is corrupted and turned into a place of death and restriction. And this is heavily conveyed of how Adam and Eve are entering this brutal world after leaving paradise, just as this kid goes back to the garden and see that it's full of priests and restrictions and tombstones. Both of these works show the coming of death, which is going to replace eternal life, and this sort of loss of like freedom and paradise of both, because it's both of them used as gardens as a paradise, which were lost. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Thank you for coming. Thank you for watching. Much appreciated. And I hope you really did get something out of this.